Good morning, friends. One of the things that we didn't explicitly talk about in this past Sunday's message, but is nevertheless a legitimate application from the message, is that true obedience and submission to God is the evidence of our having been saved by God. And we remember that when we talk about this obedience and submission, we're talking about the genuine article, which is a submission that starts in the heart, and then that disposition of obedience within comes out in the way we conduct ourselves. That produces actual, genuine obedience. And the difficulty is that it is possible for a person, as was often the case with the Pharisees as we saw, it is possible for a person to do those outward acts of obedience without having that inner submission, which means that they're not actually obeying God. And unless you know that person well enough to see their underlying motives or lack thereof, it can be really easy to be deceived by what they do on the outside. But that doesn't change the fact that outward acts of obedience are supposed to happen. Because sometimes when people are super conscious of what they do and say, when they're clearly trying to control their outward actions to be in conformity to the principles of God's law and Christ's command, sometimes when we observe that, we can actually ourselves leap to the conclusion that they are only concerned with the outward things, and therefore they must be hypocrites like the Pharisees. But that is not at all necessarily the case, because being self-controlled, watching your own conduct carefully, and having self-control in all that you do is actually a part of spiritual maturity. Just consider the fact that in the Great Commission, Jesus told the disciples to go and make disciples, baptizing them and so on. But let's not forget that he also instructed them that when they made those disciples, they were to teach these new disciples to observe all that he commanded them. So we are supposed to do, yes, even outwardly, the things that Christ commanded us to do. And did he not reinforce that greatest commandment, that the greatest commandment was to love the Lord our God with all our heart, mind, soul, and strength? And then secondly, to love our neighbor as ourselves, which he then explains is the basis for all the law and the prophets of the Old Testament, which means that all the principles of God's Old Testament commands are still in play as well. And of course, that leads to a wider conversation that we don't frankly have time for now about what laws we specifically follow and how we follow them, and if there are any that are quote unquote not in effect today. But for right now, let me just say that it is absolutely true that we follow all of the Old Testament laws of God, every last part of them. We follow them today, at least in principle. We are to be obedient to God's law in this way because God's law reflects his own character, and God's character, God's nature, does not change. So all of this to say that we can very easily look at the Pharisees, or those people that we might consider to be the modern day equivalent of the Pharisees, people who are hyper legalistic and who tend toward hypocrisy and such. And it just makes us want to swing the pendulum to the other side of the spectrum. You know, they are hyper legalistic. They are all about what you do. So we need to be about grace, and it's not about what you do. It's all about what God does. Okay, in order to not be legalistic, not to be open to the charge of hypocrisy ourselves, then we will not put much of an emphasis at all on calling people to live lives of holiness and obedience and adherence to God's command. And while I understand that temptation to do that and have at times fallen into it myself, there's something really wrong with the logic that leads us to do that. Because Jesus said point blank in John chapter 14, if you love me, you will keep my commandments. And then a little bit later, a few verses later, whoever has my commandments and keeps them, he it is who loves me. And then again, just a few verses after that, if anyone loves me, he will keep my word, and my Father will love him, and we will come to him and make our home with him. Whoever does not love me does not keep my words. Friends, could Jesus have said it any more clearly than this? If we love Jesus, if we claim to love Jesus, then we will obey him. Our love will be revealed in active obedience. Yes, even outward obedience, not only internally, but externally as well. Of course, the objection can then come. What about the Pharisees? They obeyed God. They obeyed the law seemingly better than anyone, but they didn't love Jesus. So how does that work? Well, actually, we need to go back and think about that. Is the opening premise of that statement actually true? The scribes and Pharisees claimed to uphold the law. They claimed to keep and submit to the law of God. But did they really? Actually, no, they did not. As we saw on Sunday, on many occasions, they actually twisted the law. But even where they didn't twist it, they still only obeyed it externally. Okay? Again, outward compliance without inward submission isn't actual obedience. So really, no, they didn't obey God's commands. And so their actions absolutely do fit with the fact that they didn't love Jesus, which means it comes to us. Do we love Jesus? Okay? Are we striving to obey him, to live in accordance with his will? And please know that I'm not stepping into heretical territory here as if I'm saying that we need to earn our salvation by obedience. Not at all. And the reason why I can say that is because unless we are washed by the regeneration of the Spirit, as we discussed yesterday, until that happens, which again is entirely an act of God's grace and his power, having nothing to do with our own power or ability at all to save ourselves, until that happens, we can't even begin to love Jesus or have the desire to love Jesus, much less try to obey him. So when Jesus says, if you love me, you will obey my commandments, he's talking about and talking to people who claim to already belong to him, who supposedly have already been saved by God's grace through the power of the Spirit. And so if we have someone who does claim that for themselves, they say that they are indeed a Christian, but they have no desire to obey Christ, they have no desire at all for holy living, then they aren't a Christian, no matter what else they may say. Because our obedience to Christ is the evidence that we love him. And our love for him is proof that our heart has been changed by the Spirit when he moved us from the kingdom of darkness and death into Christ's kingdom of light and life. Now again, does this mean that if we don't obey Christ perfectly, then we must not love him at all? Well, no, because while God himself loves perfectly, that's not something that any of us sinful human beings are capable of. Not until we're glorified in heaven. Then we'll be able to love perfectly. But in the meantime, it is possible to love genuinely without loving perfectly. As we read in Sunday's Assurance of Pardon, God knows our frame. He remembers that we are dust. God knows that in our current state, we cannot love him perfectly, which goes hand in hand with the idea that we cannot obey him perfectly. But again, by his grace, it is possible to love genuinely, even though it's not loving perfectly. And our genuine love, imperfect though it may be, will lead us to genuine obedience, even though the obedience itself is not perfect. An obedience that comes from a heart that is genuinely, though imperfectly, submitted to God. But let us never lose sight, even as we praise and thank God for his grace, let us never lose sight that our submission and obedience absolutely are part and parcel of our salvation. If we claim to love Christ genuinely, then we will genuinely strive to obey him. I love you guys. I pray you have a good and godly day, and Lord willing, I will see you soon.